Okay, so good morning. I've been told I have to leave on, we have to end on time. So we're going to start 5 minutes late.
Okay. Well,
So we're talking about chapter 18 in this book, which preceded this book. It's an earlier, I know it's falling apart. So anyhow, understanding our faith is the more recent one. This one goes into specifically the restoration and how everything he's been talking about applies to the restoration. So, and I'm going to reshuffle here.
1988. You wrote this one in 1988. I like to look at dates.
Yeah. And so, I had the video man. Okay. So now we're ready. We're ready to go. We're dealing with chapter 18 in the earlier Dempsey book. And before I go into this, I'm leaving the best part for Paul Bennetts to do next week. The part I'm talking about is Dempsey taking a hard look at Joseph Smith Jr. and what works and what doesn't work as far as his prophecies. Paul will come in next week and give you the good news. I'm giving you all the bad news. So part of it is, all the way through this book, we've been trying to say there are different strands of prophecy that are all blended together in our understanding of Christianity and the restoration. And Dempsey is saying some of those strands we ought to discard. And so this is a follow-up. This is a preceding book, but it's still a follow-up to what we've been talking about. And once again, you need to make up your own mind. This is for your consideration and discussion, and you don't have to buy any or all of it. Okay? So, here we go. If I can get my thing to move here. Okay. The question that he poses in this chapter is, when was Joseph Smith Jr. prophetic? And in the early restoration, the answer would be always. And our answer today may or may not be the same. So Dempsey talks about the evolving theology of Joseph Smith Jr. And by the way, I'm going to ask you for some feedback at certain points, and if you want to hop in at any point, please do so. But I'm going to try to cover a lot of information. So I'm not going to ask for a lot of discussion, but you are more than welcome to jump in at any point and ask a question or whatever. So Dempsey says that there was an evolving theology that Joseph Smith Jr. Portrayed. That the early 1830s, it was basically the theology of the Church of Christ. And that was, in fact, the name of the church at that point in time. And we consider them the Temple Lot group now. Mid-1830s, on the Kirtland, Ohio experience, that was although it wasn't called that at the time, it was what we, the reorganized church / community of Christ, that's the theology that we base our beliefs on. And then the 1940s, which would be the Nauvoo era.
How about the 1840s?
That would be a good idea.
Wow, 1940s.
Well, sometimes we went through this and actually proofed it a couple times.
Numbers are hard.
And that doesn't always work. So please pretend that says 1840s. That was the basis for the Latter-day Saints, because at that point they got into the temple ministries and that sort of thing, baptism of the dead, etc. However, Dempsey says, Joseph's contradictions were deeper than changes with time, that in all stages he pursued conflicting theologies. And we'll talk about that some more as we go along. So, Dempsey starts off the chapter with some definitions. He says that the seer, and by the way, what do we call the head of our church?
President,
President, prophet, and seer.
Oh, is it still in the word, in the title, see now?
I couldn't tell you that, but I know until recently it has been president, prophet, and seer.
Really?
And Revelator.
And we do refer to him as a revelator.
Okay.
I think that's in the title sometime.
Yeah.
And not today.
So
I see President Prophet more than anything else in their
I think
news.
we are subtly dropping the
Some
other
of
two.
it, yeah.
So how is Revelator different from Prophet?
We're going to cover that.
Okay.
We'll let's start with the seer. Seer, Dempsey says, is a primitive soothsayer in the tribal confederacy, and basically used the seer stone, or sometimes lots. Yeah, and often looking for yes or no answers. Okay.
Yeah, that goes back to the Old Testament.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Like we were covered all through.
Right.
So that would be the Urim and Thummim?
Yes.
Well, remember, it was actually a stone.
Yeah.
They called him different. They called
Okay.
him Deep Stone Joe.
Beepstone Joe.
Yeah. Stone Joe, because he would look into a hat
Yeah.
with the seer stone in there and do some of his translation that way. Translator is a product. He says, Dempsey says, is a product of the apocalyptic expectations. In other words, the idea was that the translator could look at a document and come up with information on the future, on what was going to occur in the future. Revelator, he says, is a product of the mystical age, again, apocalyptic, and that after it occurred after prophecy died. Now you have to remember that Dempsey lays out, starting out with tribal faith, tribal prophecy, wisdom, literature, etc. And at one point, he says there was true prophecy. And then beyond that, there were detours into the Persian mystical realm, etc. So that's why when he talks about after prophecy dies, it doesn't mean there's never any prophecy again. It just means that that prophetic movement died and was replaced by others in Judah and in Israel. And then he refers to the prophet as the ultimate realist. Why would you call the prophet the ultimate realist?
I say because a prophet sees things as they are.
Okay. And is he seeing things as they are, will be in the future?
No, not necessarily.
Okay, the Dempsey would say he's seeing things in his time period, delivering a message for his time period, not for people 2,000, 3,000 years later. Okay, all this, again, you can agree with or disagree. He's an academician, and he's trying to give us categories. And the prophet one, he says, is the realistic one because he's looking at the environment, his own culture, his own time, and presenting a message for his own time.
Yeah, it's a message that faces the facts.
Yes,
I love it.
yes. So,
Versus a rosy promise like
yes, right. And it'll come up several times. It has in the old book and the new one that basically a prophet doesn't make things rosy for his people. He's talking about ways in which to guide them into a better lifestyle. He's not promising a beautiful end to things. He's simply trying to guide us and advise us on our daily lives today. So, is there a conservative/liberal split in the RLDS Community of Christ?
I'm going to go with yes.
Jim.
In a way, there is. Because I grew up in the church that my grandfather and his farmer friends built in 1916, 1917. And the preachers that have preached there influenced me. And I start going to church here. And I hear somewhat liberal views that I didn't hear growing up in Mapleton.
Yeah.
And I understand that our church allows us to have different viewpoints on Scripture. But I'm not going to abandon what I learned in Mapleton growing up. I still give credence to the sermons that I heard as a kid up until all through my childhood, including the college years, those times when I went back from Pittsburgh, usually every weekend to go to church.
Well, and I think
And,
that's
so-
the beauty of this church community of Christ, is to allow for those dissenting points of view, or varying points of view. I wouldn't even call them dissenting, more varying points of view.
I believe what I believe, but I give room for others to have their viewpoints.
Mhm.
But sometimes it puzzles me the way people, they kind of tear the Bible apart, trying to discuss it to death, when the scriptures are so plain in their meaning. It's okay to discuss the various meanings, but there are some ironclad verses in the Bible that mean what they really say. And so that's my viewpoint.
Yeah.
So whoever wants to have their own viewpoint,
Yeah,
it's
and
okay.
I don't think any of us would disagree that there are some ironclad verses in the Bible. I think there are some that contradict each other, and that's why we get into some discussions. But what Dempsey says is that the split is epitomized by those who believe Joseph Smith's prophetic writings versus those who believe the prophetic writings and the apocalyptic writings. In other words, those who are focused on the more futuristic kinds of predictions versus just simply the prophetic, which Dempsey again would classify prophetic writings as those which tell us how to live life today in the world in which we live. And the prophetic approach does not prophesy about end of time things. So again, you can agree or disagree with each of these. He goes through and talks about why Joseph Smith is the way he is. And he talks about his frontier influence and says some of the things that were kind of baked into Joseph Smith were the strenuous life of westward bound frontier Yankee. So there was kind of a mobility there, acceptance of hard labor, the lack of basic necessities, because often they went without the family solidarity, which was very important, and it had to be important for people to survive, seeking social equality and a deep Christian faith, and a strong inclination toward folk magic and superstition. So Dempsey's saying all those contribute to Joseph Smith's attitude towards prophecy, towards the church, towards the founding of the church, etc.
Didn't they have like divining rods? Was that part of
Yeah.
his childhood?
Yeah.
Yeah. I remember
Exactly.
that. To find water.
Yeah. I read that he, hired out as a water finder.
Right. Find water, find treasure, found
Yeah.
lost items. Dempsey says there's a myth of the uneducated Joseph Smith Jr. Yes.
Joseph Smith Jr.'s father was a school teacher for a time, and so he knew how to read and write, do basic math and stuff. And, he had a better education probably than some frontier youth.
Yeah, in fact, that's one of the points that Dempsey makes, is that his father had been a teacher. His mother was quite literate, would read from the Bible to him often, even almost daily. Joseph was an avid reader, and Carl Cromer, who Dempsey refers to him, and I cannot find a reference to him elsewhere. I keep trying to find out who he is. He's some a religious writer, according to Dempsey, but he makes the comment that he was impressed by the richness of Joseph's language, and that Joseph was obviously familiar with most of the plays of Shakespeare and incorporated Shakespearean phraseology into his prophecies and his writings. So the whole point was to discredit the point that he was an uneducated young man who only through the power of God could do the translations and do the writings of the prophecies and all. And again, it goes back to Dempsey's point that a true prophet has to be educated in their culture and understand the culture in order for God to speak to them and give them direction. So this is from Matthew Godfrey, who is one of the three authors of a book called No Brother Joseph. And this is from Mormon Press. It says, "The biggest insight that has come to me is that Joseph was a human being who had to navigate the human experience just like you and I do. He had good days and bad days. He sometimes had disagreements with his family and friends. He suffered through the pain of losing loved ones to death, including several of his children, his father, and several brothers. He was personally hurt when friends turned against him. He had financial worries. He was concerned when Emma or his children were sick. He felt pain when hearing about persecutions of those who belonged to the church. Sometimes he had to wrestle with questions that God didn't immediately answer." Sounds pretty human. Anybody have a problem with that kind of perception of Joseph Smith Jr.? Think he's a person? Yeah, that is a person. Yeah. So we started out talking about seer stones, and this is a picture of one that is in the archives of the LDS Church.
How big is it?
I can't tell you.
Well, you know what it looks like.
I think it fits in the palm of your hand, I believe.
Oh, yeah.
It looks like a nest egg to me.
They usually say
the size of a head
size
egg.
of a
Yeah.
egg
Yeah.
or smaller,
Right.
not the same shape exactly, but it's
Yeah.
size.
No, it's a piece of wood. It's
So-
a piece of wood.
This basically, Dempsey says, Old Testament prophets are products of their culture, as was Smith. Seer stones were kind of a folklore of Western New York, and supported looking into the stones the owners could see or know things not normally possible. And Smith used the seer stone in a number of cases when he was looking for treasure for other people, when he was looking, obviously when he did the translation of the book, parts of the translation of the Book of Mormon. And Dempsey says the test is, did he, Smith, put this background behind him to the extent that he was free to follow wherever the spirit of truth led him? And so the point is, was he tied to this older, what Dempsey calls the older fashion of prophecy that is not as effective as the true prophet would use? So yeah, but that is a picture of the seer stone, and that the LDS Church has in their archives.
So would you just find them on the ground, or?
Yes, actually, you would.
Look
In
at that.
fact,
You ask the questions and then he answers them.
Oh.
he was digging for a well in 1822 and found the seer stone. He used it to locate lost property and found water, which we've already mentioned. Fame spread for 150 miles to Josiah Stoll's farm, and he went treasure hunting there. And to his credit, he said there was no treasure to be found. And even more to his credit, Josiah hired him to continue working on the farm and do some things with him after that. So it wasn't like Stoll said, "Oh, you
I think
don't
I
know
found your
what you're
Carl
doing."
Cromer.
Pardon?
I think I found your Carl Cromer.
Good, because I Googled it and I went through church histories and I couldn't find him.
I just wrote religious writer. He wrote the book, The Farm Boy and the Angel, The Mormon Vision and the Winning of the West, New York, Doubleday, 1970.
Wow. There's
So
what I gotta get.
Oh,
He lived between 1893 and he died in September of 1976.
Okay. Well, thank you for that. I never would have thought about searching him the other way. So,
Well, when you said he wrote religious,
yeah,
I just added that.
good. Thank you. Emma described the stone as dark color, almost black, with light colored stripes, about the size but not the shape of a hen's egg. Now I want you to know that that is not the stone there. That one can be had for $39.95. Online you can buy seer stones. So,
I'll find one.
yeah.
That's
Well-
not your own venture there, is it?
No, from Jonathan, buy from Jonathan.
And you can buy it from me for only $45.
Jane, maybe you should get one of those for your trials.
No, thank you. That'll make it even more dangerous.
Okay, and Dempsey talks about the growth of the prophet, and says in the early stages of translating the Book of Mormon, Joseph used the Urim and Thummim. We've already mentioned that, and these are replicas of what they might have looked like, and it's based on Old Testament that the high priest would wear a breastplate vestment, and in it would be these two stones, and they were one yes and one no, basically, and they would cast those stones to get answers. Now, these are ones for sale. I don't know if these are exactly what Joseph saw or had or whatever. Yes.
But I think Joseph used the term Urim and Thummim pretty loosely, because I think he referred to his seer stone as a Urim and Thummim also.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like maybe any eight.
Yeah.
Is a Urim and Thummim, I don't know.
Well, and he also referred to them as being like spectacles. So there was something to hold them, So we're a little fuzzy on exactly what Joseph used. Of course, we already talked about the fact later on witnesses say he would look into a hat, have his seer stone in there, and that is the method for translating the portions of the Book of Mormon, later portions of the Book of Mormon. Spring of 1828, Martin Harris wants a seer stone. Joseph basically says that any man can find a seer stone. Anyone can find a seer stone. And so Martin goes to look for it, and he looks into his, and he says, all is as dark as Egypt. So I guess Egypt must be pretty dark. So it just didn't work for him. A year later, Oliver Cowdery has been transcribing for Joseph, and Cowdery wants to translate too. And many of you probably remember this prophecy, or the prophecy that comes later. And basically, Dempsey says that shows a maturing process, that he no longer needed the seer stone or the Urim and Thummim. In fact, later on, he doesn't need any device to prophesy. Yes.
When I was in grade school, first time I ever went to World Conference, Mom and Dad and brother and sister, anyway, we usually go to the opening thing because we lived in Mapleton. Anyway, there's a display there of the Urim and the Thummim. The brass plates, the whole thing, and the display case. I said, Mom, look, the Urim and the Thummim. And Mom said, Jimmy, that's just a model. The Urim and the Thummim was taken back into heaven.
Yeah.
And I said, oh, okay. And I thought it was a real thing.
Yeah.
And then she reminded me that because Joseph Smith had did something he wasn't supposed to do, like telling a friend about some of the things that he was discovering using the Urim and Thummim, he wasn't supposed to do that. Then the Lord took it away, took it back up to heaven.
Yeah.
Okay, so, but I thought it was a real thing.
Yeah.
When I first saw it,
Yeah.
that it was a model. I don't know if any of you remember seeing that. It was, yeah,
I
Yeah.
don't remember that.
I
it
don't
looked
remember.
like the real thing.
I don't remember running up and down the ramp, but I don't remember.
Yeah. Those ramps are fun to run up and down.
They were, especially as a child.
Yeah.
Now they're almost like climbing a mountain.
Dempsey goes on and says that Joseph outgrew the need for psychological crutches, and he's saying the Urim and Thummim and the seer stone were that he got to the point where he could interpret, to prophesy without the aid of anything physical. There's little evidence that Smith reverted to the use of the seer stone, but he still prized it all the way through his life. Now, like Samuel in the Old Testament, he found a better way, but never totally outgrew the way he started, which is with some physical device to translate. Here is here's the section 9 of Doctrine and Covenants, verse 3, where he's talking to Oliver Cowdery, where Cowdery has found this stone and is not able to translate. He says, "Behold, you have not understood, you have supposed that I would give it unto you when you took no thought, save it was to ask me. But behold, I say unto you that you must study it out in your mind, then you must ask me if it be right. And if it is right, I will cause that your bosom shall burn within you. Therefore you shall feel that it is right. But if it is not right, you shall have no such feelings, but you shall have a stupor of thought that shall cause you to forget the thing which is wrong. Therefore you cannot write that which is sacred, save it be given you from me." How many of you have heard that scripture before, or paraphrase of it?
Yeah.
Yeah. The whole burning of the bosom and that feeling that things are right. There's only one problem with that. What's the problem?
Well, if you truly believe it, you might get that fuzzy feeling.
I have sat down with members of the Community of Christ, and we both have a different interpretation of something, and we both feel it in our heart that that's right. One of us probably is wrong. So, and so basically Dempsey asked the question, was Joseph a full-time or part-time prophet? Meaning, was he always a prophet or just part of the time? And Emma Hale Smith was overheard by Vida Smith saying, Joseph was but a man, save when he was moved upon by the Spirit of God. And that becomes important later on as we talk about some of the revelations of the Doctrine and Covenants that were literally moved to the appendices. Emma recognized a hard but important fact. Prophets were prophets only part of the time. That's Dempsey speaking. And that's Emma, of course. And I'm not sure which child that is. I don't know if anybody else knows, but
She looks pretty tired and worn,
yeah.
careworn.
Yeah. So, I went through all my old Doctrine and Covenances. I think that's the plural. And these are the sections that have been removed. Now, I've listed the two groups. This one are the ones that were actually considered revelations at the time. So section 107, which really dealt with the construction of the Nauvoo boarding house and the baptism of the dead. Basically with Joseph saying more light will come later on about baptism of the dead. That's 1841. That was moved to the appendix and has since vanished entirely from the Doctrine and Covenants. Section 109 dealt again with baptism for the dead, and same thing, 1842, and again was in the appendix and now moved entirely out of the book. And section 110.
Version, or did they take it out in the Mormon also?
Pardon?
Are those in the Mormon version?
Yes. There are.
They still have it.
The numbering is different. Their numbering in their document Covenants is different than ours, but that section remains in theirs. So,
Oh, yeah, yeah, you've seen their temples. They still have baptism for the dead.
some of you may
My
have
dad
gone,
was in the Mormon, so.
Huh?
My dad was a Mormon.
Oh, yeah.
oh, okay.
I've been to a couple of temples before they were dedicated, and they had everything that was described in that prophecy.
Well, and what's interesting, Joanne and I
Scared
went
me.
to the Nabu temple before it was dedicated, so
Me
they
too.
let the public go through.
Mhm.
And it's a fascinating building. Of course, it's got the big baptismal font with on the backs of oxen and all that sort of thing. It's pretty magnificent.
Gold.
But we don't get into the baptism of the dead. It was in our Doctrine and Covenants for a while, and then was from the appendix. I think it was it 1970 that they moved them to the appendix. I think 1980, I think they moved out entirely, something like that, in that time period. So, and then there are 3 or 4 more actually that were in the appendix, but they were not really revelations. There's a statement regarding the death of Joseph of Hiram. That was section 113, which has been moved out. The Joint Council report, which basically talked about organization of the church, the Lamoni, the college at Lamoni, talked about the role of the Joint Council, et cetera, et cetera. It was basically administrative kinds of things. It was moved out. And the W. Wallace Smith resignation and instruction, since it was not a revelation, but rather a letter of resignation with some instruction on what was to follow, that was moved out. And finally, you may not have known that the Joseph Smith prayer of blessing and designation was in the Doctrine and Covenants for a short period of time, and then removed when it was determined it was a forgery. So,
Salamander.
okay. Question is, why was Joseph predisposed to such speculative predictions? And again, it refers back to his magical expectations of frontier culture. This is the first factor. And stop me if you have comments. Stop me at any point. So,
well, then he also, at least according to Dempsey, view it as continuing some of the Old Testament prophets.
Yeah.
Well, not even the Old Testament, could be the New Testament too. With,
yeah.
Apocalyptic prophecies.
right. Dempsey talks about the biblical literalism of his time, and he, of course, was very much into reading the Bible literally, and of course, Isaiah, Daniel, Ezekiel, other prophets prophesied for the future, and so Joseph felt a need to be in that same mode. He hadn't gone to Dempsey's class yet, so he didn't. So, he recognized his call to prophecy and felt called to echo Old Testament prophets, the priestly, the apocalyptic, the mystic, the givers of wisdom, as well as the prophetic. So each of those others are what Dempsey claims are lesser forms of prophecy or lesser prophets. Well, he gives an example, and in the example, he uses the famous Civil War prophecy delivered on Christmas Day, 1832. Is that in our Doctrine and Covenants?
Mm-hmm.
No.
Okay.
No.
I was gonna say, I don't think so.
No.
I don't remember studying it.
Here's what the prophecy says, and I'll show you the prophecy in a second here, highlight, underline certain parts of it. War will start in Charleston, South Carolina. Slaves would rise up against their masters. All nations would be drawn into the war. Remnants, he refers to them as remnants, but we know he's talking about the remnants of the house of Israel who came to America as Nephites and Lamanites, et cetera, would vex Gentiles with the sword, which is an interesting term since they use bow and arrows and
Yeah,
so.
no sword.
So here's the whole prophecy. And I'm not going to read the whole thing to you, but if you look at the top, you can see it says the rebellion, beginning at the rebellion of South Carolina, which will eventually terminate in the death and misery of many souls. He goes on to say that that war will be poured out upon all nations, beginning at this place. For behold, the southern states shall be divided against the northern states. He goes on to say that in order to defend themselves against other nations, or the South will call on Great Britain to defend themselves, and other nations will be called upon, and the war shall be poured out upon all nations. Says, slaves shall rise up against their masters, who shall be marshaled and disciplined for war. And it shall come to pass that the remnants who are left of the land will marshal themselves, and shall become exceedingly angry, and shall vex the Gentiles with a sore vexation. And thus with the sword and by bloodshed the inhabitants of the earth shall mourn, and with famine and plague and earthquake and the thunder of heaven and the fierce and vivid lightning also shall the inhabitants of the earth be made to feel the wrath and indignation and chastening hand of an almighty God, until the consumption decree hath made a full end of all nations. So it's going to be the end of all time. And it says, wherefore stand ye in holy places, and be not moved until the day of the Lord come. For behold, it cometh quickly, said the Lord. And we assume that quickly means that it's coming in his time period. And so that's the revelation.
Written in December of
32.
Okay, let's go back. Yeah. What was the time?
Christmas Day.
Did I say?
Christmas Day,
Yeah,
1832.
Christmas Day, 1832. Yeah.
We got one thing wrong, right?
Well, and which one what did he get right?
South Carolina.
South Carolina?
Yeah, it was.
And why would he have gotten that right?
Story from newspapers.
Well, it was 30 years before it happened. So how would he have gotten that right? I don't know. I always looked at Dennis. How would he know?
My understanding is that South Carolina in the 1830s was threatening to be.
There you go.
Yeah.
Well,
And say they were kind of the center.
They were the forerunner of
Great Britain.
Carolina was one state until it was split later.
Of course, it did actually secede in, 1861.
Yeah, right.
Well, and Great Britain aided the South.
Yeah.
They didn't come in and fight, but they helped them, and can't remember what ways, but I know that Great Britain was sympathetic to the South because of the cotton.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and
the slavery.
if you think about it, the Great Britain was the arch enemy in the past. I mean, we had gone through,
Yeah.
the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812.
Yeah.
And so, in a sense, that part of the prophecy is accurate, and it's probably accurate because it fulfills Dempsey's requirement that you address issues of your time.
Yeah.
And if Joseph is really aware, which he appeared to be, of the circumstances in the country, then that would be a legitimate view. But much of it is.
But John Brown did try to form a slavery uprising, but it wasn't too successful.
Yeah.
Also, the comment about the sword, that's become a symbol of war. Yeah. Not necessarily that they're using the sword to fight it, but it's a symbol of war.
True. But there's a good portion of the prophecy that did not come true.
Oh, yeah.
And I think that's the point that Dempsey's trying to make.
Yeah.
Is Joseph Smith is human. He may be inspired by God, but sometimes he goes out on the limb with his own belief, his own personal beliefs. So, where the prophecy falsely taught the end of the world was not near, God would perform astonishing deeds without regard for human actions. And remember, this goes back to some of the apocalyptic prophets of the past. That Dempsey says that they were trying to tell, when they were in exile, they were trying to tell the people, hey, you don't have to do anything. God will save us. And Dempsey's view of a true prophet is, they say, these are the things we must do to change our lives, to change the culture and the world around us. Spectacular natural signs would usher in the event, and of course they didn't. God would do it to bless his chosen people and heap vengeance on their enemies. And so the two questions that Dempsey always asked to determine a real prophecy is, was it factual? Was it actual, ethical, and loving? So what's your judgment? How do you weigh it?
On this part, big no.
Okay. Dempsey says, in this, Joseph was like Ezekiel. We did not always distinguish between the ennobling insight of infinite wisdom, in other words, really understanding the will of God and how it should affect people today, speculations arising from their own heart or compassion for his fellow exile. So as part of that compassion, his exiled people under duress that causes Joseph to come forward with some of the prophecies. He's trying to give the people hope, but he's stepping beyond what heavenly inspiration he's really been given.
It's got to be hard to discern, for sure, when you're sitting there trying to write the final thing down. Okay, is this really what God told me, or am I thinking for myself?
Well, and I think most of the Latter-day Saint prophets that we're aware of, who have been president, prophet, and seer of our church, they have gone through a lot of prayer and a lot of writing and rewriting to get down what they believe is the will of God. So it hasn't ever been, it's seldom let's put it this way, it's seldom a very spontaneous thing. It takes a lot of thought and prayer. Dempsey goes on to say that the next section of the chapter talks about Latter-day Saint dispensationalism. I have a tough time with that. What does that mean to you? What is the dispensations of time? What does that mean to you?
I don't know. I just think people get so caught up on the end that they don't take care of now.
Yeah.
Well, I can remember being younger, which is not as hard to imagine. But anyhow, I can remember listening to discussions of so many dispensations of time. And I don't remember all the details. I should have looked it up because I probably have some of their old stuff available still. But basically the idea was that there were so many dispensations up until the time of Christ, and so many times to until the coming forth of Joseph Smith and the Book of Mormon, and then there'd be another time, and then we get to the end of time. That there were certain periods of time. Yes, go ahead.
I'm gonna take a guess, I bet there's seven.
Seven. I bet there would be.
Just because of the magic number
It's a
seven.
magic number. Yeah.
I don't really know, so I'll take that as.
So I probably skipped about 4 dispensations of time in there.
Would it also be considered dispensationalism in terms of time and place? I was always confused about how Hill Cumorah could also be where Nephi hid the gold plates. Because, even as a child, I'm like, how is this possible? How did it end up in New York? And I think our whole movement has tried to answer that question. Even now, there's all these trips to Southern America and stuff to try to figure that out. Was it the Mayan culture? No, probably not. We just have, that's that whole dispensationalism is how I look at it. Is it?
Well, and the basic crux of it is that God has preordained certain time periods, and at the end of those time periods is the end of the world.
Right.
Christ comes.
Right.
The apocalypse and Christ comes.
Yeah.
So Dempsey says that's basically part of the apocalyptic Persian detour. That information was not there prior in Judaism. And again, like I just said, preordained dispensations of time. The world is in the final, Latter-day Saint dispensationalism says the world is in the final stage of collapse.
Yeah.
What's the hint that was commonly perceived?
I mean,
Yeah, our name. The Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Only divine intervention can save us. We can't save ourselves. Only divine intervention can save us.
1,000 years is for the book.
I didn't hear that.
well, and we're Latter-day Saints. We're not Last Day Saints.
Yeah.
So we don't really know when that's been.
That's true. It's true.
But it keeps telling us, they keep telling us that the time is upon us, that we have a short time to
Yeah.
prepare.
Yeah,
I don't know,
exactly.
the end of time believes, it's, we humans have a pretty narrow
Yeah,
view of
we
what
do.
time is. I mean, the universe took billions of years to evolve. I don't know how many billions of years it required for it end. I don't know.
It's a few billion.
So I don't think that we should be saying, okay, the end is right here and we better get ready.
The end is near.
I think you just need to each day
Yeah,
in
you
a
do.
Christ-like manner.
Well, and I think you have to be careful if you believe that it's imminent, that you don't throw everything to the side and simply wait for the end. And I'm not sure that's what Christ was ever asking people to do. I think he was asking us to love our neighbors and love God. Jim had a comment and then go to Dennis.
Well, as a child, I was taught through the church, and also my mother every once in a while would say, she'd say, Jimmy, Jesus could return at any time. You need to prepare yourself and be ready.
Yeah,
Okay, and that's the truth. There will be a second coming. Okay. And I think it behooves all of us,
But the point
not
of,
just me, to reread the book of Revelation. Just study it and read it.
Well, and my mother believed that we were living in the latter days.
That one
She
book, I
also
think,
had-
is neglected by our church, and it should.
She also had a patriarchal blessing that said she would be around for the second coming, and she's passed on. So I think there was a lot of hopefulness in that.
Well,
Dennis, you had a, oh, I'm sorry.
Oh,
Let's
sorry,
get
go
Dennis.
ahead.
He had a,
Well, in Joseph's time, in the 1840s, Miller and his movement, apocalypticism was prevalent back in that time. It was also prevalent when Jesus walked the earth, because when we studied our book, St. Peter versus St. Paul, the Paulines were telling the Patrines, well, they were saying they were wrong because the Patrines were expecting an imminent end, and the Paulines are starting to say, no, it's been delayed or something.
and
Well,
that's been the conflict. Yes.
I think the better point for us to take is exactly what Jim's mother said to him, is that we need to be prepared at all times. It's all about our own life and our own preparation. So all of us trying to figure out the exact time makes no sense to me. It's just like, well, oh no, he's going to come as a thief in the night. We don't know. And so why don't we just focus on who we are following Jesus Christ now? That's the point of our parents.
I was going to say, I agree with Sharon. We need to not be so concerned about when Christ returns, but live as an example of as close to Christ as we can.
Could be tomorrow. It could be after we die. It doesn't mean your mother didn't live a Christ-like life. Just that particular prophecy didn't come true.
It may not be the end of the world. It may be our end.
Yeah.
And it's
The end of
important to
time
live
is when
each
you
day.
die.
It's just our time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe
Our
there's a
time.
second coming in heaven.
There you go, I don't know.
So anyhow, the last factor is the church was to prepare a religious community of Christ, operating as a community for Christ, operating as a base or as Zion. So that was
That's
part
the
of
one that kind of.
that's part of the Latter-day Saint view of this dispensation of time. And as a result, Smith changed the church name from Church of Christ to the whatever it was.
The
Latter-
Church of Jesus
The
Christ.
Church of
Latter-
Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. It's hard for me not to start that with the reorganization.
I know, it is.
I think Dempsey would have said the next, the last point was prophetic.
Yeah. Yeah. That's going with the now.
Yeah, it doesn't mean that, well, what it does mean is that Joseph Smith was prophetic in many cases, and sometimes he erred as a man, but in many cases he was prophetic. So Dempsey says, as discussed earlier, dispensational end-of-time philosophy did not enter the thinking of Judah until the Persian detour. He said that the prophetic theology held there was no preordained dispensations. The whole basic thrust of the prophets is that persons and nations are free to determine their fate by their conduct. I didn't read that very well, but that's the point. So. And now it's a little bit of background because it's still part of the section, so I'm going to run through this quickly. This is background, and it'll make sense in a moment here. Just so you know, the Rosetta Stone was created back around 196 BCE, somewhere in that range. It was discovered in 1799, and it was discovered in Rosetta, Egypt. It's an ancient. It was written in ancient Greek, which was translatable at that time. And one third of it.
We also had Egyptian Demotic and Egyptian hieroglyphics along
Right.
What was the first Egyptian what?
Demotic, I think so.
Yeah. If you take a look at it, you can't see it very well. Look at the very top. There's about a third that's a different texture than the next third, than the bottom third.
Yeah.
And so the bottom line is it was deciphered over a period 1822 to 1824 by a Frenchman. And I don't speak French, so I'll let you do that. He and Champollion, is that it? Something close to that. Pardon?
Champollion.
Champollion. Okay.
Yeah.
And Thomas Young. The two of them, Young actually wrote back and forth, but they were also kind of a rivalry trying to translate the Rosetta Stone. And it includes, this is what Dennis was referring to, it includes 3 languages. Ancient Greek, which was translatable at that, early on. Egyptian hieroglyphics, which was the priestly sacred script, and Demotic, which was a simplified version for those people who were not, it was not sacred, that is for the common people who were literate. Okay, so on the stone, you've got 3 different sections, and there was always a kind of a feeling that they were somehow related, but in essence, they are the same information in 3 different languages. And that's why it's referred to as the Rosetta Stone. Now, that happened in 1824. In 1858 is the first English language publication that I can find. Prior to that, there are publications about the translation in French. I don't think Joseph Smith spoke French. So the point of all that is, here's just an illustration again, to show you the 3 different languages on the Rosetta Stone. The Book of Abraham and the Book of Mormon occurred in that time period between 1858 and the 1824 time period when the Rosetta Stone was. So Joseph Smith, in all likelihood, had no concept of how to interpret hieroglyphics. Okay, that's the only point I was trying to make by showing you the Rosetta Stone.
Did the news of it make it to America?
I couldn't tell you. The first reference at 1858 reference is University of Pennsylvania, and it's a Philomathian Society, which is a scholar society. So my guess is that it was not commonly known. It may have been known in academic circles, but if that's the first publication, there probably wasn't much information on it prior to 1858. So we get to this. The translation was a unique combination of frontier folklore and the apocalyptic expectation to function as a rebel. That's Dempsey's comment about how and why Joseph Smith translated these scrolls. In 1835, which is right in the middle of those two time periods I was talking about, Smith was offered 4 Egyptian mummies and scrolls, and the scrolls found with them. He bought them from Michael Chandler for $2,400, and who supposedly was a nephew of Antonio Bilolo. I don't know. I can't say these guys' names, but there was never any evidence that they were related. So we're not sure of the provenance of the items, although they clearly were Egyptian mummies and clearly were papyri.
Well, wasn't that time period kind of popular for buying mummies?
Yes, it was both England and America. It was very popular.
To own a mummy.
To own a mummy. Yeah.
I learned when one of the displays was down at Union Station that I went through that it was popular back in that day to buy a mummy and have a party, and you would unwrap the mummy at the party and give out the little amulets and things that were found within as party favors to your guests.
Okay. Interesting. More than I really ever wanted to know.
Egypt must be heaven because my mummy came from there.
Right. Translation process ended by November 1835. The first publication wasn't until 1842. And Smith had just taken over at that point in time, Times and Seasons. And that's what it was published in. It wasn't published as a separate book. So we're running out of time, so I'm going to basically just cover this quickly.
Well, this was a big detour.
Yes.
Joseph Smith.
Yes.
And he was deluded on this translation.
Yeah.
He knew nothing about what he was doing.
Well, what was interesting is Chandler came in and basically said to him, everybody I talked to says you're the only person who can translate these scrolls. And so I suspect that it went to Smith's head a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
I think I should probably stop at this point, and maybe we'll pick up this time. I may turn this over to Paul to cover, or I may just cover a little bit at the beginning of the next lesson, because I think there's some things I want to focus on here. So the same sheet, if you have the chapter 18, we're going to be discussing that again next time. Okay? How's that sound?
Sounds good.
Okay. I was so sure I could actually get through this all, but I've yet to complete.
You don't count often long enough for audience participation.
Yeah, I like the discussion. I prefer the discussion, but
I was actually going to prophesy that you would not be able to finish.
and I think that's a true prophecy. Oh, well. Well, thank you all.
Thank you for all your work.
We'll see you next Sunday.